Well, hey, happy Thursday. It is Thursday already. I can't believe it. I feel like it was just Thursday. So, welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. As always, I'm Katie, joined by Chris and John. This week, we're actually going to do a walkthrough of Gephi. The past couple of weeks within the live stream and our podcast, we've been talking about influencer marketing. And one of the ways that Trust Insights identifies influencers is by using a software package called Gephi. And Chris is going to dig into that. Now, Chris, knowing up front, I've seen you walk through it and I've seen you describe it. I will be interrupting you to ask you to explain what the heck it is you just said. So please be prepared for constant interruption from me. It's a day ending in Y.
It absolutely is a day ending away. Okay, before we do the Gephi thing, before we dig into network graphing and graphing databases, which are the technology, we should probably talk about the process itself and the concept of influencer identification, because there's different schools of thought about how you do this. So let's go ahead and flip over to our fancy whiteboard here. When we're talking about influencers, there's a whole bunch of different ways to think about this. Let's do three nodes here. Let's do a Katie node here, a Chris node, and a John node. Now, let's say that, as we've joked in the past, that Katie talks to me, and John talks to Katie, and then I talk to Katie, and then John talks to me. Now, the question I have here is, based on just this very simple three-node network, how would you think about influence? Like, what are the kinds of things that you would see as useful here to say, like, who's influential?
Well, it's definitely not John, because no one's talking to him. As expected.
And I think you've captured a really important point in that statement. Not that no one talks to John.
John, I'll talk to you later.
But it's not who does the most talking. It is who is most talked to. Right? I think it's an important distinction. So let's just do a very, very simple bit of math here. I have one incoming connection. I have two incoming connections. So I have a score of 2, right? Katie has one incoming connection and another, and so she has a score of 2. And poor John has a 0 right now.
Poor John.
But if we were to also say, if Katie's got this one incoming connection here, and she passes a little bit of that, like 0.5 of that to me, that would bring my score up to a 2.5, and vice versa, right? So if you think about in the old days of SEO, when everything we talked about was page rank, right? This is effectively the kind of very simplified algorithm of how page rank works. It's who links to who, and those inbound links, which we all love to talk about in SEO, are actually a network graph. Now, when we're talking about influencers in social media, we're talking about the exact same thing. A lot of very primitive influencer tools out there will do very straightforward things like saying, who does the most talking, right? In this case, John does the most talking, right? He's talking to 2 different nodes. And so in a very primitive influencer marketing system, you might say, oh, John's the most influential. He talks to everybody. Yeah, but is he the person that everybody else listens to? Right? Is he the person that everybody else talks about? Not necessarily, at least in this very simple example. Now, if you start to add in things like, let's say you start adding little followers along the way here, and then you have all those communications going back and forth to and from your followers and talking to each other, and they all start talking back to you, now you start to see essentially a bigger picture of influence. So this is kind of how we think about influence. And when we're choosing the kinds of algorithms we want to work with in influencer marketing, we have to give some thought as to what does that algorithm look like when we're doing it, on screen. And this is one of the big bones I have to pick with influencer marketing software that's out there on the market. Nobody tells you what the algorithm is on the inside. There are 43 different methods of choosing influencers. There's 43 different algorithms you could use. And I've not seen a single company, save one, that tells you which actual algorithm they're using. They all say it's a proprietary, blah, 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 the usual B2B sales pitch. But if you don't know that algorithm, you don't know what kind of logic they're using. Are they using the logic that says John is the most influential person because he's got the biggest mouth, even though he might be talking to the air? And we can change other names around here. But is it Katie? Is it Chris? Who in their algorithm would get the nod?
Right. And I think that's an important distinction, because it all starts with what is your goal of using an influencer. So if you want the person who we consider the broadcaster, the person who sends out the most information, then you would want John as your influencer, regardless of if the information is coming back.
Exactly. So let's actually go ahead and do a different version of this. Of Katie, we have John, we have our friend and teammate Emily, we have me, right? And John talks to Katie, John talks to Emily, Emily talks to me, Emily talks to John, Katie talks to me. In this case, to what you were saying, Katie, sometimes, let's go ahead and, if you want to get to influence this node here, you can't talk to John because John doesn't have a direct connection to me, right? You'd have to either talk to Emily, who's got a connection here, or talk to Katie, right? So to your point, do I want the loudest person? Maybe. If I'm hiring a Kardashian or any other big mouth influencer, they're basically walking ad machines. You insert a credit card into some part of their body and ads come out, right? So that's the broadcaster style. You have the who is the most talked about, which is the most incoming connections. But you also have, in this case, Emily would be an example of one type, a connector, somebody who can make the connection between you. So if you are, say, a B2B marketer, and you are trying to get an appointment with the VP of marketing at, like, I don't know, Cisco Systems, right? Do you talk to the biggest mouth in the room? Do you talk to the subject matter expert? Or do you talk to that middle node that says, yeah, I know Katie, I can get you an appointment with her? And those are kind of the three big models of influence.
Let me ask you this question, Chris, because when I think about that strikes me as something that LinkedIn does, sort of adjacently. So if I'm trying to get in front of the VP of marketing somewhere, but they're not a first or second degree connection, I start to go down my list and see, well, who else might be connected to someone who's connected to someone who can maybe introduce me to someone who can then, sort of those 6 degrees of separation.
Exactly. And that's what, this graph database or this network graphing technology can do, is to help illustrate those connections at a bigger scale. Obviously, if you're just trying to get one appointment to one person, you can do that legwork on your own. And with LinkedIn, you have to, because LinkedIn does not do any form of data export, period. But on other networks like Twitter and Instagram in particular, you can get that data and you can start building those maps. So let's look at an example of how you might do this. We're going to use Instagram today because Instagram is sort of the darling that everyone's paying attention to. With Instagram, there's 2 places you can get your data. You can get it from the API directly, or you can get it from a third-party service. The one that we use is a service called CrowdTangle. It's by Facebook. They have really restricted who can get an account, but they do still technically accept applications for it. And what you get out of that, let's go ahead and move our whiteboard out of the way. What you get is just a big, gigantic pile of data from them that contains things like the account, the username, the followers, the posting created, and this is at the post level. So every single post that an account creates over a specific time period, the comments, the likes they get, the number of views if it's a video, what kind of post it is, and then links to all these things. So our first step in the process of doing influencer identification is to extract out from all this stuff the actual connections, right? So what we need this information, but we need it in a machine readable format. To do that, we write our own code for it. I've not seen a system that does it for you that's an off-the-shelf piece of software that you can buy. There are some influencer marketing services that can scrape the data and then use it in their own algorithms. But the challenge with those is that you have to then use their algorithm because they don't give you the data. So we ended up writing our own for this.
So that was going to be one of my questions, Chris, was what if I'm a marketer and I don't have the resources to write my own code or build an API connector directly into Instagram? And so for those who don't know, and I'm sure there are a few, an API, the way that I describe it, and Chris, let me know if this is correct, is basically an API, if you think about it, is like a tunnel that the data passes through. So you need to put that connector tunnel in between your system, and it might be R or BigQuery or SQL or something like that, and the software itself, Instagram, pick a software. And so that tunnel basically says, okay, data, now you have a safe place to travel through from where you are to where I need you to be.
Yeah, that's a good enough analogy. It's like, it's a plug. You plug something into it, your software plugs into it, and you get stuff out of it. To the question of how do you do this if you don't have that capability, you have to hire it out. Either a contractor or work with an agency of some kind that will do it on your behalf. Or again, you can, there are some influencer marketing companies I think probably will do it for you. Whether they'll give you the raw data or not, I don't know. I've not yet run into anything that I can think of off the top of my head. So that aside, once you have the data and it's processed, it gets turned into a list, and it gets turned into a very simple kind of list. The list looks a lot like this. It's just a list of who was talking and who they talked to. Just, lots and lots and lots and lots of these. And this is the raw goods that goes into the network graphing software, because we want to build this, the drawing that we were doing, we want to build a map of that, but at a much larger scale. Now, this is where you do need software, and the tool that, as Katie mentioned at the top of the show, is a package called Gephi, Gephi, Gephi.org is where you can pick this up. It's a very, very good tool. It's open source, so it's free of financial cost. So let's go ahead and import our data that we just processed and bring it in here. Let me go find where it is on my hard drive.
And this is a section where I'll be interrupting you a lot. And John, even though nobody talks to you apparently, feel free to also interrupt and ask questions.
Now, how about, is this, a lot of folks use Tableau because they get that with Salesforce. Are these similar as far as what they're solving?
No, none of those visualization tools do network graphs. It's actually an interesting gap in the marketplace. And the reason for it is it's a relatively specialized application. It's not something that you would run into in your standard marketing yet. It's interesting because there are a lot of places where they're starting to use network graphs, whether or not the users know them. Like every time you log into Facebook or LinkedIn or Google, you're using a network graph. You just don't know it. So we've loaded all these nodes in, and right now it's this unmanageable big black box of all these nodes. We have 24,000 individuals that we're talking about. I think we choose travel as the segment here, and 27,000 connections between them. So our first step is we got to weed out people who are talking to the air, right? People who are talking and nobody's listening. And you'll see that the centrality measure we're going to use is this one called this Eigenvector Centrality, which is mathematically, I won't get into the math on it because it's just ugly, but it basically is who's most talked about is the algorithm I'm going to use. There are other ones available in here. Gephi supports 4 or 5 other ones, including who's in the middle, who's the shortest distance across the network. But I like the who is most talked about because, again, I think that represents influence reasonably well. So let's go ahead and run that.
When you're picking, Eigenvector Centrality or a different anchor point, is this something that, like, when you first opened Gephi, you were like, okay, I need to do some Googling because I don't know what the heck Eigenvector Centrality even is?
Yes. You should also pick up some linear algebra because it deals a lot with matrices and matrix math. If you want to get into the guts of it, you don't need to know the math to use the tool. You just need to know what the buttons do. But to research that, to know what the buttons even mean, yes, there's going to be some Googling and there's going to be some math. Okay, so our first pass, we'll notice in our data, has created these scores from 0 to 1. All these network scores are 0 to 1. And what we're going to get rid of is essentially everyone's got a zero score, right? A zero score is just somebody who is talking to the air and not doing a whole lot. So
all right, John, you didn't make the cut.
I know this is it. John J. Wall at Twitter being flushed.
You're out.
There are also, because the way Instagram's data comes out, it comes out very, very messy. There's always going to be some like weirdness, like people who have mistyped a handle or put it half of a handle in. Those are going to be largely single letter handles. So it is safe to get rid of those. Now, just in doing this, we have thinned out network graph a little bit. It's starting to get a little bit more sparse. There are programmatic ways of doing this that don't use Gephi. You can actually do this inside of R or Python and do multiple passes, but we are not going to do that because it's not really much fun to look at. So we're going to do this a couple of times and let the software kind of weed through the network and say, okay, now that we've gotten rid of the people who just love to talk to the air and tag, there's always those jerks on Instagram who just like tag 80 people in their post and put 500 hashtags. Once you get rid of them, then the graph starts to really thin out because you're getting rid of basically people who are also talking to the air. You can see it looks qualitatively different now. I'll do one more pass through just to clean house here.
So why are you picking, when you click Eigenvector Centrality and you put in a number, you have in there what, 1,000 or is it 1.000?
It's 1,000. So how many iterations, how many times is the software going to go through and recalculate the entire graph? So is it 1 time, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times? Generally speaking, you kind of go with sort of the graph size. So if the graph is, actually it's the graph size inverse of it's the inverse of the graph size. The larger the graph is, the fewer iterations you're going to want to do. Otherwise, you're going to be waiting for days for this thing to finish up. I've actually had that happen. So now we've got a thinner graph. We've gone from 26,000 nodes down to about 4,000 of these things. The next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to color code this because right now it's just kind of a big unmanageable mess. And so we're going to color code it. We're going to use something called modularity, which is a type of clustering. It says, okay, if we go back to our network graph here, right? Who is in these clusters? So, for example, I might draw a cluster, as we very primitive one, around Chris and Emily, because Chris and Emily talk the most, right? And I might have a cluster of Katie and John because they talk the most. We're going to apply this same idea, but at a much larger scale to see who's talking to who within the graph. And so we're going to go ahead and run our modularity calculation.
So it sounds like that might be one of the misconceptions around some of this influencer identification is not everybody is going to be connected to each other just because they appear on the same analysis. So in your example, Chris and Emily were connected and Katie and John were connected, but Katie and Chris weren't connected and John and Emily weren't connected. And so I think that that's an important distinction for this is just because two people appear on the same network graph analysis doesn't mean that there's any connection between them. And therefore, that's why the color coding and clustering is a really important feature. Exactly.
So I just turned the colors on based on that. We can see there's this cluster 4 here, which is about 6.5% of all the nodes, sort of the tightest one. We're also going to want to adjust the bubble sizes to be who's most talked about and who's doing the most talking, so we can get a better sense of like who is getting most talked about. Now we're still at a point here where this is not super useful yet, right? There's still a lot of clutter on the screen. So our next step is we're going to want to use one of the sorting algorithms that are built into the product to arrange the network to be essentially more visible as to who's in this box. And you'll start to see as it runs, it's going to pull nodes apart and start pulling those clusters together to organize them. Let's go ahead and zoom this out a little bit. And already you can see, parts and pieces are starting to pull away and you're starting to get a sense of, oh, okay, I can kind of see the network. You can see those big stars along the edge, those big triangles. Those are nodes that are doing a lot of talking. But you can see there's not a real big bubble at the end of those, right? Those are kind of, people talking a lot but not being talked to. And then in the middle, you're starting to see, these larger nodes here. There's a lot of incoming conversation to those nodes. So those are the people that in this model of influence, those would be the influencers, the people like, yeah, I that's a person who everybody's talking about. And when they have something to say about travel, maybe we should pay attention. I'm going to go ahead and just for cosmetics, attach names to these nodes so that you can just get a better sense of who these people are.
So Chris, I want to back up just a little bit because so you went from this sort of like, big cluster of things to this sort of more pulled apart. And on your layout, you clicked a bunch of buttons and magic started to happen. So can we just, at a high level overview, just sort of walk through some of the options that you chose? Because it looks like you have, force axis 2, and then you clicked a bunch of buttons and you changed numbers. So, I'm assuming that as you get more familiar with the functions in Gephi and you know what some of these things mean, such as like, again, you picked Eigenvector Centrality because that was the algorithm you wanted. I'm assuming the same is true of how you're organizing things. So, force axis 2, why did you choose that versus something else, for example?
Yep. So these are all layout things. These don't fundamentally change the influencers themselves. This is just these are all visualizations, and you can choose, a couple of dozen different versions. The Force Atlas 2 algorithm, there's a whole mathematical paper on it. Essentially, it tries to balance out the prettiness of it with computational speed. There's some other ones in here that are really beautiful graphs, but this would be a 10-hour live stream, and 9.5 hours would be us waiting.
So you've done this before.
Just a few times. And then the thing to look at with each algorithm is it tells you like what are the different numbers and features you'd want to turn on to understand how they work. Some of them are pretty obvious, like dissuade hubs. This just says, please don't lump things on top of each other so I can't see what's going on, right? Other ones, like approximation and stuff, you do have to know what a Barnes Hut optimization is to know essentially, how it's doing its computations, it's spreading things out in the graph. So there are some features that, are pretty obvious and some features are not. But this is all visualization. This is not computation, and that's a really important distinction to make. So we've got ourselves a nice network graph here, and if we want to switch over to preview mode just to make it look a little bit prettier, I'm going to change the fonts and things just to tighten them up a little bit and make a prettier printable graph. Let's go ahead and zoom in here.
And if you follow the Trust Insights Twitter and Instagram accounts, then this visualization of influencers should look familiar to you when events happen, like Inbound or Content Marketing World or any other events. This is the analysis that we post showing, everybody's posting on social media about this event, hashtagging it, who's most talked about at this event. And so you would expect to see at Inbound, for example, you would expect to see HubSpot squarely in the middle, for example.
Exactly. So what we've got here, and just a quick sanity check. Do we see anything in here that would be relevant to travel? Yes, Ritz-Carlton, Canon USA, the camera company, right? We got a whole bunch of different resorts and things, different tourism companies. So we at least know from just a quick sanity check. Visit California is a hub. Yes, that makes logical sense, right? We're not seeing things like, financial technology companies in here. That would be kind of weird to have that in here. So at this point, we now have a visualization that we can use to see, okay, do some of these things clump together? Are they, for example, a lot of these companies, when we dig in, the sort of the travel and hotel stuff seems to be in green, and there's other stuff like tourism and technology stuff like Canon in gray. So we're starting to get a sense of who these people are. Now, this by itself is cool to look at. It's not very actionable, right? You can't just immediately look at this and go, I know exactly who I'm talking to. But the nice thing about network graphing software is that with it, we can just turn this into a very, very simple spreadsheet. And then from there, you would take the spreadsheet. I'll go ahead and export this because let's open up the spreadsheet.
So Chris, with that network graph, so it looks like it's clustered, all of the nodes or people or accounts, whatever you want to call them, together that are in some way, shape, or form connected. And that's the color coding. And it sounds like you've cut out anyone who doesn't have a significant number of connections or two-way connections, for example. So if, I originally showed up in tourism and I was just talking at a bunch of people, but nobody was coming back and reciprocating, then I would have been cut off the list.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
Okay.
right. So when you turn this into a boring old spreadsheet, and you sort by that eigenvector centrality, you end up with, a decent list. And now at this point, you could take any of these individual human beings and go chase them down on Instagram, see if they're open to sponsorships and things like that. What's really interesting, I think this is very telling about how influencer marketing works. When we did our extract of all the people who were essentially doing the talking, we got things like their follower counts and things. And you can see a few of these rows have those numbers in them. Look at how many rows don't have any numbers in them. Why? Because they weren't the ones doing the talking, right? They were the ones who were being talked about. So just in a quick look at this influencer export, we can see there's a whole bunch of accounts that if we had just gone on who was loudest, who had the most engagement and the most followers, we would have missed so many people. I'm going to do a quick spot check and see if this account is any good. I'm going to do off screen in case it's not safe for work, because that happens on Instagram.
Yeah, because another one you've had in the past, I've seen on this report, a factor for whether it's a fake account or not, whether it's something that's just publish only too. So to be able to separate the ones that where there's a human versus it's just some bot cranking out stuff.
Thankfully, we can show this one. This one is actually the Waldorf Astoria in Los Cabos. 1,700 posts, 83,000 followers.
Yeah, there we go. Red Rocker, Sammy Hagar, Cabo Wabo. Right on target.
And yeah, this is a very nice travel account, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I think is interesting, though, look at the follower numbers and stuff. Not a huge following, right? They're not an organization that's got 10 million followers. This is an account that has a good size following. Certainly, no one would be arguing with it, but they're talked about. Right? This is a destination. This is clearly is based on their stuff. A clear place that you would want to go. After being on lockdown for a year, looks like a place that we would want to go. But
well, one of the things that I want to ask Chris, because what I'm not seeing, for example, and maybe this is just not included in this type of analysis, is whether or not these accounts are being talked about for good or bad reasons. And so as you're getting this information, you definitely want to do your due diligence. So let's say, for example, you were looking at the Waldorf Astoria in Los Cabos. Okay, great. They're talked about a lot. Why? Was there a problem? Was there a legal issue? You want to make sure that you are doing all of that checking before you're just going ahead, listing, okay, go find these accounts and bring them on as influencers.
And that's a really, really important point that has to happen before you use network graphing, right? So at this point in the process, when you are just slinging code, you will see here in our filtration, we have a line here that says filter for just the term travel used in description. That's sort of the basic filter. You can add in filter, do sentiment analysis, do even something as simple and basic like check for swear words or check for racial slurs or anything that you would not
bugs.
want to have. Yeah, bed bugs, or things like that. That has to happen in the data extraction phase. So when we think about in the IT world, there's this concept of ETL, extract, transform, load, and it's a way to manage the process of data. We extract the data from a place, we transform it, and then we load it into a final form that a user can use. So this point here in R, this is the extract and transform phase where we have extracted the data and we're starting to transform it. And those transformations need to happen. And you have to think about the business logic that you want to have at this point. By the time you get it over to the networking software, it's too late. You can't do those kinds of transformations in there. Now you have to do them in the extraction phase. So a big part of doing influencer marketing really well is documenting out the process and the requirements at this point. And this is where influencer marketing software really kind of hoses it, because a lot of the software packages don't offer those capabilities to say, yeah, I don't want to include anybody who supports a certain politician or shares images of, I don't know, cats. They're a dog person. They don't want to see any cats. You'd have to do that here. You can't do that in the graphing section. By that time, you get what you get. And that's what you kind of happens with off-the-shelf influencer marketing software is you get what you get.
So, John, I have a question for you. So, Chris, if you can bring up the visual again, so you focus a lot on business development, John. So one of the things that I'm always wondering is, if someone from the outside of our organization is looking at this, what is their initial reaction? What do I do with this information? So from a business development perspective, like let's say you're looking for, new sponsors for Marketing Over Coffee, how do you start to think about this and bring this up? And is there information that, you wish was included in this, keeping the Excel spreadsheet in mind that comes out of it? Like, what do you look for from that perspective?
Yeah, right. So, because as Chris had talked about, the chart is great eye candy, and that has marketing pull. Because we use that for trade shows. Every time we do it for a trade show, all the speakers there are like, "Oh, I want to see my dot on there. I need to know that I'm important." So that happens all the time. But yeah, the juice is right here in the spreadsheet. Actually, this is where you're going to do your marketing work. It's been a while since we validated this, but what we had seen last time we had run numbers on this, I know, was that those top 3 accounts, you're going to find Kardashians and people up there where you could pay, $250,000 for 10 Instagram posts or whatever. But once you get down to, number 14, 15, 16, you're going to find people that you can work with for, $1,000 or $10,000 who have almost the same degree of influence as those others. And in fact, what you'll see a lot of times, the big names are always watching those names around the 70% marker. And that's where they're that's where they find out about the cool. They found the couple of tastemakers. And even though those people don't have have never done a reality TV show, so they don't have the millions of followers, but they're necessary. And so, yeah, you're basically cutting out the celebrity by doing this kind of stuff. And it's, the magnitude of expense. If you're going to do some influencer marketing programs, it's just, usually takes it from absolutely impossible to, you could probably afford to do it.
The other thing that's really important there is that, to what John was saying, in this phase, in the extraction phase, we chose travel as a super broad term. And of course, we get tons of travel stuff, right? I was looking at one of the other things on their list, and there's, this travel person, 106,000 followers. They travel and they do stuff. They go places and things. Is that right? Or should you be incorporating things like from your SEO work? Like, is travel too broad a term? In our case, would podcast be right? Or would marketing podcast, people talking about marketing podcasts? I might want to be much more thoughtful about the data that goes into the network graph so that I get a much more focused list, because then I don't have to worry about spending $100,000 on an influence, right? If I've narrowed down not just travel, but maybe we want travel in New York City. Okay, who out of this whole travel field, how quickly would that list thin out if it was only people talking about traveling in New York City? So that extraction phase matters a whole lot when it comes to influencer marketing.
Well, and I think that that's an interesting point, because you're talking about it from the perspective of us trying to find those influencers based on what they're posting. But then, it's also really good reciprocal advice for those accounts that are trying to be found for those things. And so, we typically think of SEO as just, search on search engines like Google, Yahoo, that kind of thing. But it's also just as important for how you're posting on social media. So if you have a travel account on social media, but you never say the words, that you want to be found for, of like, travel in New York or travel abroad, or, you never use those terms, you're not going to be found in an exercise like this. And that's a big miss, because maybe you have 1 million followers, but no one's ever going to find you because you're not using the right key terms in order to be found. So it's a reciprocal, SEO exchange.
Exactly. One of the things that we discovered in our Is the Gram Doing It For You paper, which you can get over at trustinsights.ai, is that, some influencers see decent performance, with 10 or 15 hashtags in their posts on average. Like, this is not, once or twice every night. Like, they're shoveling in the hashtags all the time. But it's focused, right? Like, to your point, it is focused. It is on target with what people should be doing. And the thing that we tell people is, if you're a brand starting out, look at 1 to 3 hashtags, but power tip, take your SEO keyword list that you've done for optimizing your search side and start using some of them in Instagram. Because if someone's willing to search for, Bali travel or New York City travel on search, logically, they're going to be doing the same thing on Instagram. Because, Katie, as you've pointed out many times, hashtags are how people get discovered for specific topics. And if you've found a niche that works really for you, the old expression still holds true. In niches are riches.
I've literally never heard that expression.
Come on. Let's say that for years.
There's a lot of expressions that you tell me that you've been saying for years that I've never heard before. But I digress.
Exactly. So if you got some comments or questions about this, leave them in the comments on the platform where you're watching this, and we'll see it here in the show. But to recap, data is differentially available on different platforms, right? Twitter is robust with data, and you don't need much to extract data from it. Instagram, Facebook, Reddit, there are pieces of software that can get you some decent data out of those services. We mentioned Facebook's CrowdTangle. Some platforms like LinkedIn, just not happening. You can, and there's a way to do this, you can proxy some of that with some very clever coding. If you've got some very clever coders on staff, you can look at people who are linking to LinkedIn posts as a way to identify some interesting content, people who might be worth sharing. Use the SEO tool of your choice for that. So that's where the data comes from. We talked about some of the common mistakes, like, hey, stop looking at the biggest mouth in the room. And then a couple of the identification algorithms with the warning that there's so many packages of software out there that claim to do the thing, but they don't tell you how they do the thing. And so you may not be getting what you're ordering. So any other thoughts, Katie or John, on the fun of influencer identification?
Well, I think that, in terms of the black box of the algorithm, Chris, you pointed out a really good potential mistake that some of these algorithms have is you don't have the opportunity to say, and I don't want to include the following terms or topics, so that's just you're going to pay all of this money for influencer marketing software and you're not going to get what you want. Also, like we always say, start with, what's the question you're trying to answer? What's the goal? What kind of influencer are you after? John, you gave some really good examples of what to do with the information. And if you're looking for someone who's maybe not as well known, but is influential so that it fits within your budget, there are ways to be looking at that information.
That was your cue, John.
It's true. You're right.
This is why nobody talks to John.
I know. Well, and I'm here trapped. I'm like thinking of fake adages that I can use. I mean, like, the monkey doesn't dance where the beaver goes. But I don't know what that means, but that's okay. These are adages we have.
All right. Thanks for watching, everyone. We will talk to you next week. Bye. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and a weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.